Welcome back to Business Ethics. My name's Tom, and this week we're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 5, or at least some themes from Chapter 5, and um, and I'll go over some points in my notes that are in this module. There are aspects of this chapter and of the book where um, they tend to talk about morality. I think we talked about this in the beginning. They tend to talk about morality as something like your individual code of beliefs, and that it's subjective and it changes, and it's whatever values you happen to subscribe to, and that's not really helpful or useful. I don't think it's really accurate either. Most studies in ethics do not really subscribe to such a view. Um, Mostly because it becomes difficult to see how you understand yourself to pass judgment on others if you just view your ethical views as just your own, which might be the case for a very narrow amount of decisions you make. Um, but by and large, we tend to think that our own values are the values, right? Or at least values that people should recognize, right? So, anyways, um, so this chapter goes on a little bit of a tangent, capitalizing on that idea, but I do think there are some important themes to get at in this chapter. So the first one is they mention this distinction between normative and descriptive approaches to business ethics, and that's an important distinction to have in your mind as we're going through different things. And we've already seen a little bit of both of those. Um, One is, when we talk about descriptive approaches to business ethics, that is an orientation where you're just describing what businesses have done, right? What has happened and how did people react to it? So when we're like studying like pieces of legislation like the SOX Act or something like this, you know, this is the ethical issue that arose, and this is what people did in response to it, right? Now, when we're talking about a normative approach, we're talking about kind of building systems or a system of values that are going to guide and direct you. They're going to tell you what you ought to do. That's what norms are. They're like rules, right? So when you're talking about things that practices you should adopt, right, as a business owner, or arguing about what businesses really should do in response to a particular issue, that's a normative approach. Okay, so it's good to have that distinction in place and be able to separate them, because just because businesses react in a certain way to certain social changes doesn't mean that what they're doing is the right thing, right? So those are just two different aspects of the way in which you can do business ethics. Um, Now, there is another distinction they make here between individual factors and organizational factors when it comes to ethical decision making. And they have a pretty narrow idea of what individual factors are. And we'll go over them in just a second. And then, so I have an example that's in the book, and some of you might remember this. United Airlines um, got into a lot of hot water for removing a passenger from a flight that was overbooked. I believe they wanted to give the seat to a crew member or a pilot that needed to get to the next destination, and they had screwed up, and they'd already given the seat to someone. They were actually sitting in it, and they actually called security and physically removed him, and he got injured, and it was not a good situation. And in looking at this situation, it's although it's easy to pass judgment on United Airlines for what they did, it's difficult to understand in the concrete, right? If you imagine you're, a flight attendant, and you're told that this overbooked, we need to remove this passenger, and you're on the loudspeaker asking someone to volunteer to give up their seat, and no one's doing it, and you can't leave, and all these things kind of come into play, and what you say to security, and all these kinds of things. How the person reacts and how the other passengers react to how you're reacting to them, and there's a lot of different factors in that kind of concrete situation. And they make kind of like a broad distinction in the book between individual factors and organizational factors. And individual factors in your ethical decision making has to do with your interest as a particular individual, right? So, who you are and your background and all the things that make you a particular individual um, will factor into how you see a situation and the kinds of things you want to get out of a situation. So for example, if you're looking at a company to work at and you're older, right, let's say you're in your 50s or something like this, you might think about their retirement plan or something like this, right, or medical benefits more so than someone maybe who's younger in the workforce. And that would be an individual factor in your decision making, right? Something that's specific to you. Now, contrast that with organizational factors. Organizational factors have to do with the interests of the company as a whole, right? So, what is the company's mission statement? What are they trying to do? What kind of culture are they trying to produce, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing I like about this distinction is that as we move forward, we start to talk more detailed in a more detailed fashion about corporate culture and how that functions. Um, Notice that there are cases in which individual factors and organizational factors kind of come together. That is to say that there are cases in which your interests as an individual and the interests of the company you are at um, coincide, right? And this is actually probably a really, I mean, it is a good example of what it means to have healthy culture at a workplace, right? So when your own sense of purpose aligns with the purpose of the place you're working at, then things go much more smoothly, right? So that'll be something that we'll look at as we move forward. But to break this down a little bit, I do like to, at this point, just start to um, uh, break down the idea of what it is to have a business as a kind of social structure, right? So different kinds of organizations have different power dynamics, as it were, in a very general sense, not in a what would you say? Not in like a bad sense of power dynamics, but there are ways in which you distribute tasks and people you have to answer to, and ways in which that's set up, right? Um, so I give an example of two very kind of like opposing opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of social structure. And the first one is a democracy, right? So a democracy is a particular kind of social structure where you have a very pronounced reciprocity between the people who kind of lead and the people who are, kind of like the general public who are supposed to be served by those leaders. So in a democracy, you vote on various things to establish some kind of authority, and that authority is put in place in order to serve the interests of the voters, right? So it's a very cyclical kind of thing, right? You vote to establish people, say judges or something like this, and then they're supposed to help decide the law that you already agreed upon, and therefore serving your interests, right? Um, in a democracy, it's very decentralized, or it's supposed to be a very decentralized kind of power dynamic, right? Where everyone has a voice and everyone kind of contributes to that. Um, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I give the example of the military, right? The military is not very democratic, right? It's not like everyone has a choice and everyone has a vote, and you just, whenever you're thinking about, a mission or something like that, they get everyone's input on it, right? That's not really how it works. It's a very top-down structure, right? And that's out of necessity, right? You need to be able to do complex things very, very quickly that are oftentimes a matter of life and death. And so what you do is you have this very top-down structure where the people on the top make the decisions and the people below them are supposed to have kind of like a strict obedience to what the people above them are saying. So you have a very firm hierarchy, and you have a very firm chain of command, as they say, and that's how that works. It's very undemocratic. But those are just, I mean, they have different functions. They're different kinds of things, and they're different kinds of social organizations. And So they have different structures. When it comes to a business, it's somewhere in the middle, right? And this is why business is really interesting when it comes to its social dynamics. There is definitely a top-down element, and different businesses are more or less democratic depending on how they're set up. And I'm going to like bracket the idea of a co-op just for purposes of discussion, but you know, um, employees have a voice in many companies about what they want to do, what they want to do with the company, their own positions, and so on and so forth. But also, if you own a company, you can make unilateral decisions about things. I mean, there are boards of directors sometimes when you have very large companies, but there is an element in which you have to have mm, a certain degree of obedience, right? Otherwise, they'll just fire you. So it is somewhere in the middle. Now, and to return to the claim I made before, in a healthy group or an efficient organization, it's one in which the interests of the individual align with the interest of the company or the group as a whole, right? That's when you see your own purpose as the same as the place you're working at, right? As those things kind of separate, the more you feel like what the company you're working at is doing something that you don't care about, right? The less efficient you're going to be at your job, right? The less invested you're going to be. And people who aren't invested in their work tend to not do very good work. This is not an absolute um, claim here or something like that, but this is kind of the idea behind having more of uh, um, you know interesting and purposeful workplace, right? That's just to kind of set up the idea of corporate culture that we'll talk about more. And also, as we kind of go through some of the specific components of an ethics program, that distinction, that idea of like putting together your organizational individual factors will come about in different ways, right? Looking at different chains of communication, looking at how you exact punishment or rewards, and tailoring them to meet the needs of your employees, and so on and so forth. So that's it for today. And I'll be talking with you soon more about all this stuff.